these questions began to occur to me, and part of it involved research, finding that there were actually stories that no one had really told, and also adding my imagination and saying, here's what the story could have been if we had listened to a woman's voice.
Welcome to Sacred Rebel Voices. My name is Jerry Zehr. My guest today is Rabbi Sandy Sasso. Sandy is part of the first generation of women rabbis in American Judaism, and she was the first woman ordained in the Reconstructionist movement. Alongside of her pioneering rabbinic leadership, she is also a gifted storyteller whose children's books have helped generations explore faith, compassion, and what it means to belong. Welcome, Rabbi Sandy Sasso.
So nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's good to be and have you here today. And, you know, I was interested, Sandy, as I've known you and your husband, Dennis, and so much of your journey when you were one of the first women, you know, who was ordained as a rabbi. Take us back to that moment when you first knew that this was your calling and how people responded.
Well, I would say it first occurred to me that I would want to be a rabbi when I was 16 years old. It was an unusual decision at that time, but I loved the synagogue. I was in love with Jewish tradition and ritual and study. I very much admired the rabbi of my congregation, and I thought to myself, that's what I want to be. I want to do what he is doing. And it all began, I suppose, one evening when we had our confirmation service, which was a special worship service for 16-year-olds to confirm their connection to Judaism. And after that service, I came home and sat on the edge of my bed and I said, that's what I want to be. I want to be a rabbi.
Wow. I think that's so powerful to think when you didn't really have any of the women rabbis. I mean, what was the response from your parents and other people?
Well, look, some of the response was very positive. My parents said, you be whatever you want to be. We're behind you. So that was wonderful. You know, my fellow students, my friends thought it was terrific. Why not? Many people thought that, you know, I would get older and I would change my mind. But for the most part, people were pretty tolerant. First of all, I kept it a secret to begin with. It was a little embarrassing for me to say I'm going to do something that no woman had done before. So I tended to keep it pretty quiet, except for my close friends, my close community.
Well, and one of the things that I love about you is I've known you, you have a sense of humility and you're not like one of those rebels, you know, when we were talking about being a sacred rebel, and that's what this whole story is about. But yet you did kind of challenge, you know, the institution, and that was breaking new ground. And as you started getting into that, what was the pushback you got? What did you have people saying, you know, this was not your place? And
oh, yes, definitely. So, you know, I guess the word rebel at first when you mentioned it, so it caught me unawares. And I always think as a rebel as somebody who is fighting against something. And I always saw myself as striving to make happen what I am for. Not what I am against, but what I am for. So I sort of saw myself more as an advocate and a witness. But I think the same qualities can be understood in somebody who rebels against tradition. But I was also seeking to preserve much of the Jewish heritage at the same time that I sought to transform that heritage, knew it needed to continue to evolve and grow. But I will give you an example. When I completed, close to completion of my first year of rabbinical school, there had been an article in the newspaper, and I received a letter. And I will just read a piece to you because you'll understand this is reflective of the broader opposition that existed. The letter said, "My note just comes to you to let you know that I read the caption of the article and I was never so unhappy for such a long time. Frankly, I just don't understand what would prompt a Jewish girl to have the chutzpah, the nerve, to consider herself eligible to become a rabbi. The very idea of a female rabbi makes me sick. And my first reaction was, she must be nuts. Still, you look pretty enough. So I'm hoping you will do a very great deal of studying, and somewhere along the line, you will find out that you are pursuing the wrong goal. And you might just back up and end up on the right track after all. I sincerely hope so. Ordinarily, I would sign off by wishing much success, but this time I will refrain. In fact, I frankly hope you don't make it, for your sake, for my sake, and for everyone else's sake." That was written in July of 1970.
Wow. And how did that feel when you got that letter? And
well, at the beginning when I entered rabbinical school, I didn't expect as much opposition as I received, because as a teenager, I was very welcome in my synagogue to do everything. I was asked to lead services, to give little sermonettes. I was very involved in my youth group. So I didn't quite understand why, once I had grown out of adolescence, all of a sudden everybody was opposed to what I was doing. But it didn't take me long to learn about the long history in which women were excluded from leadership roles in the religious community in general and in society in general. It was easy to be angry, but, anger takes up way too much space in your head. And there's no room then to be creative and positive. So I had to, in some way, put that aside and say, that's not really my problem. That's the other person's problem. And go ahead and pursue what I loved dearly. And in the process, to seek to make changes that would allow Judaism to become more inclusive of women's voices at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And I appreciate it as you talked about the sacred rebel, that it wasn't not against something, but what we stand for and what we want more. I mean, that's what I think is a sacred rebel. And I think your point about, not holding on to anger and having that fuel you, because, that just eats away at you. But that still took a lot of courage at a young, because how old were you when you were in rabbinic school?
Well, how old was I? I graduated college in my early 20s, and I started rabbinical school right after college. Yes, okay. I was very young. And I had a lot of growing up to do and a lot of maturing to do. I learned a lot. What was happening at that time in like 1969, 1970 was the beginning of a whole new wave of feminism in general. Mm-hmm. And I really looked to the secular feminism to see, what it could teach me that I could use as I studied to be a rabbi. But feminism at that time did not address religion. Mm-hmm. And then I also, looked to Jewish studies, Jewish leadership, Jewish scholars to enrich my own Judaism. But I was deeply Jewish. But Judaism didn't address what I would call my feminist soul. So at that time, there were these divisions: feminism, Judaism, or feminism, religion. And what I sought to do in those early years was to find a bridge between the two, to build a bridge that brought them together.
Yeah, and I can imagine, because again, you didn't have a lot of role models. So, you're just kind of breaking ground and trying to find your way. And where did you do your rabbinic studies at? Because I know that's where you and Dennis met, right?
Yes, we did. So yes, when you say no role models, I mean, I did use some of the rabbis I knew and admired greatly as role models, but they didn't quite look like me. They didn't dress like me, and so they were models in some way. But I didn't really have a female. Well, I didn't have a female rabbi, to give me some direction. And what's very interesting, I think the early pioneers in religious leadership, they were starting a new path, but there were no directions. There were no guideposts. It was like you're out there and you have to begin to forge this path. I studied in Philadelphia at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, where both Dennis and I were students. We met in our first year and we got married at the end of our first year. I was the only woman at the school until my third year.
Yeah. And I can imagine that some who are listening to us, maybe some other women who are thinking about their own lives and they're, maybe that they want to take a new path, that they feel a sense of trying to be true to themselves means that they have to let go of some things and take a step forward. And they're afraid too. I mean, fear is a part of that. I'm sure you felt some of that. What would you say to them if they're feeling some of that same questions that you were feeling?
Well, I think first you have to believe in yourself. And I think second, you have to surround yourself with others who believe in you. You really can't do it alone. There are lots of people who came before you who paved a path that you're walking on. Learning about their history and their voices is very helpful. You're always, on someone else's shoulders. And because of that, you can stand a little taller. And at the same time, you need a community. And I was fortunate to have met Dennis, who supported me in everything I did. I had some wonderful mentors, a rabbi in my congregation, the dean of students of the rabbinical college, who wanted me to succeed and help make it happen.
And I should say, and Rabbi Dennis Sasso, who your husband, who you both met in rabbinic studies, yeah. And he's a great man because he was like, he supported you, he encouraged you, and to have a man like that in those days, that says something about Dennis too. But we'll talk to Dennis at some other point.
Okay. Well, the difference is, you see, there were no women professors. There were no women who were helping lead the college. I was the only female voice there. However, and what happened was I would read texts and I would study history, and I all of a sudden would say, somebody's missing. I'm missing. Women are missing. Where are their voices? Yeah. What did these characters say? What were these women's stories that we're not telling? And all of a sudden, it wasn't just that I was asking questions. I was asking questions that nobody else had asked before. And the truth was there was very little material or few resources. I mean, when I was asked to speak about women in Judaism, I said, oh, well, what's my first goal? We didn't have internet, so you go to the library, right? You look for books. There was almost nothing about women in theology, nothing about women in Jewish history. It was so sparse that I had to begin to find my own original resources and think a little bit more creatively.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's for many people who are living their life and maybe they're not happy where they are and they feel that stirring and it's starting to ask questions, starting to ask those questions and go out and reach out to that. The other thing I appreciate so much was, and as a pastor in the Christian tradition, we focused on the male figures as well. I mean, and then it came later that we saw a lot of the women who were supportive of Jesus in his ministry that were never lifted up. Many characters within the Hebrew scriptures, like Deborah and other women throughout our scriptures who got overlooked. And the richness, I think, that we are finally coming to say, wow, there were many women who were very influential who we've never heard about. And we're lifting them up and we're seeing the real gifts that I think women and men share together that we can appreciate.
I would say, part of the issue is who wrote the text that we are studying in seminary, whether it was rabbinical seminary or in a Protestant seminary. Who wrote those texts? Well, they were men. Nothing wrong with that, and I wanted to study those, but I was never seeing the narratives or the history through the eyes of women. What would a woman say if she was talking about what happened at Sinai? What would a woman say if she was on the ark with Noah? Who is Noah's wife? Why doesn't she have a name? What was she doing? All of these questions began to occur to me, and part of it involved research, finding that there were actually stories that no one had really told, and also adding my imagination and saying, here's what the story could have been if we had listened to a woman's voice. But, you asked another question, maybe we could go there, about what you do when you want to do something unusual and you're a little bit afraid. So there's a poem that comes to mind by one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver. She says, as long as you are dancing, you can break the rules. Sometimes breaking the rules is just extending the rules. Sometimes there are no rules. And what I love about that is the first line, as long as you are dancing. If you love something so much that you're dancing with it, really nothing can stand in your way. You just keep dancing. It's your passion. And are you going to fail? Oh, absolutely. Are you going to make mistakes? Of course. But you're going to get up again and you're going to start dancing again. I mean, the image we usually think of in regard to success and moving onward in your career is the image of a ladder, where you just keep stepping up and up and up, and it's kind of linear. That's not how success really works. And from a woman's point of view, it's more like a labyrinth. You get lost, you go the wrong way, you make some mistakes, and then you finally end up at your destination.
Wow, I love that. And I love the idea of that something inside of you just is so moving that it makes you want to dance. And how wonderful. Which leads me into being a rabbi. And I'm interested in, first off, some people maybe don't know what it means to be a rabbi. Maybe they've known a Christian pastor. Is it similar, because many Christian pastors as well, is it similar to being a Christian minister, or are there differences in being a rabbi, you think?
Well, it is similar in some ways, because a rabbi is a pastor, somebody who sits with people throughout the life cycle, comforting them and also celebrating with them and making celebrations more meaningful and helping people through the dark spaces, through the valley of shadows. So yes, a pastor, like a minister, a Protestant minister is a pastor, also a preacher, somebody who teaches, and somebody who, speaks to or with the congregation, educating them in the tradition and addressing contemporary concerns and issues of meaning. What does it mean for me to be here and to live a good life? And also, I also said a teacher, very much an educator, somebody knowledgeable in the tradition, and somebody who is with you through the life cycle, who knows the ritual to help you be familiar with what are the traditions and the words that are spoken to help us move, from birth through adolescence, through maturity, through death.
Is there anything that's different as a rabbi, you think?
I don't know. I think the training is somewhat. Also, you're a spokesperson for the community.
Right.
And when you're in a community, in a congregation, you're often looked to as someone who will speak on behalf of your community. And you're engaged in interfaith work, and you're engaged in civic work. because the obligation is not just to care for your smaller community, but for the society in general.
Right.
Because you're part of that society, and the prophetic tradition in Judaism requires of you to care about what is happening around you and with other people. I think the training is a little longer, or at least from my background. We had to have a college degree. We had to train for 5 years of graduate study, and along the way, we received a master's. I actually worked for a doctorate, which I received later at CTS. And so it's a long period of study. And then usually, your first congregation is more like an internship, right? You're an assistant. And so it requires a degree of academic knowledge, and as well as pastoral and life cycle knowledge.
Yeah, I think they're very similar paths of what you described. I think of what my experience was. I always believe that faith leaders have to be involved in the larger community. I would always find some people wanted me to focus more on the local community and not be involved as much, but I felt as you are that we have that prophetic voice. I mean, that's part of who we're called to. What was one of the things that you loved about being a rabbi? And then what was one of the hardest things that you experienced about being a rabbi?
Well, I loved a lot about being a rabbi. And, to be able to be with people at the most vulnerable times of their lives is a privilege. It's an honor. And I mean vulnerable in sad times because of loss, but even vulnerable, a little bit fragile during happy times, because all those times are, liminal moments when things change. Your status of who you were is no longer going to be the same. And that's a great gift to learn so much about life from the people whose hands you hold as they walk through the cycle of living.
Mm.
And I love teaching. I love to teach. It's very exciting. I liked working with kids. I love storytelling. I'd like to be able to take a complex idea and make it accessible for everyone.
Yeah.
I look, as a rabbi, you'd learn a lot of theology, and you talk in very abstract language, philosophical language, and often it's really not comprehensible, really, to yourself or to anyone else. How do you take these sort of high thought ideas and make them concrete enough that everyone can embrace them and talk with you as well?
Yeah. And what was the hardest thing that you experienced, do you think, about being a rabbi?
Well, there are lots of hard moments. I mean, you could go back to the life cycle, when a young woman with triplets, young children, finds out that she has a terminal disease, and you sit with her and talk about life. Those are hard moments,
Mm-hmm.
Or someone calls you and says, I don't think my life's meaningful. I want to end it. Those are just difficult times, and you want to be as present as you can be and do the best that you can at that moment. But then if you look outside the sort of life cycle, personal dimension, there is, how do you get people to talk to each other when they disagree vehemently? How do you create a community out of a heterogeneous group of people? The wonderful thing about a congregation, you can have a group where everybody is homogeneous and you all agree with each other and you have a wonderful time. But what does it mean to build a community where people aren't homogeneous, where they come from different backgrounds economically, in a variety of ways in terms of their knowledge, who have completely different political views, different approaches, and somehow build a community out of that diversity? That's very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And yet I agree. I think, when you're with people in the sacred moments of their life, that's an honor. And it's part of being part of their lives that they've let you be a part of. And then you're so blessed by that. And also the difficulty of just, as a rabbi, you're 24 hours and your lives are, you're dealing with that your whole life. And then when you and Dennis, as a clergy couple, you're living it all day long and bringing it home. So that's part of it too. When I talk about sacred rebel, part of it is, for our own life, finding our own voice. But the other part is how we engage in the larger community. And you've been a part of that. I know you've been at different rallies and spoken for issues of justice and trying to bring a prophetic voice, if you will. Yeah, there's a wonderful picture of you there. Do you remember where that is? Where were you?
Yes, I do remember. It was the first women's march in Indianapolis, and I was asked to speak. And it was an empowering moment because women were feeling, and I was feeling along with them all, that many of the advances that had been achieved in the 70s were now being lost. We were going backwards. And I remember rallying for many women's rights over the years, and all of us, and then I thought, oh, well, we've accomplished this. Women now can get their own mortgage. They have their own credit card. They have reproductive freedom. There were things that were happening. And then all of a sudden it was going backwards. And so I was asked to speak at the Women's March. And I remember saying that, I remember actually telling a story, and by saying, we each can do something. It was a story about a fire and that was in the community, and people said, well, we don't have any buckets, we don't have any hoses, we're never going to put it out. And a wise person said, just take a teaspoon. Take a teaspoon and take some water, and one teaspoon after another teaspoon will be enough to put out the fire. And I remember holding up a teaspoon and saying, we each have a teaspoon, and we're going to have to bring our teaspoons to make change happen again.
Yeah, and I believe in that, and yet I think there's probably some people who are looking at things in our society now who've been trying to make a difference and trying to change, and they feel like, is it really making any difference? And how do you probably had that within yourself, questioning, why am I out here? Why am I doing this? Because it doesn't feel like it's making a difference. How did you respond for yourself, and how do you say that for other people?
So I'll tell you a story about how we started a new organization here in Indianapolis, Women for Change, Indiana. So after the 2016 election, a friend of mine, Jennifer Williams, who owns the funeral home here in Carmel, and she and I were talking, and we said, we're despairing. How is this possible? We're going so far backwards. What are we going to do? And actually, Dennis said, let's stop complaining and do something. And so we said, okay, we're going to bring people together. We're going to put out a little post on Facebook. We're going to bring some speakers who know a lot about politics and women's reproductive health and history. We're going to say they're coming, and we're going to expect maybe 25 people come, and we'll begin a conversation. Well, that's not what happened. Not 25 people came. 900 people came, and there was not even enough room to fit in the space we had designated. And in fact, some people said, oh, I went home. There was such a traffic jam, I couldn't get to your place. And that ended up starting an organization here in Indiana called Women for Change Indiana, which is now 5,000 women strong.
Yeah.
So, sometimes you think one little step doesn't mean anything but one little step, one little teaspoon after another, after another, after another can make change. You can't despair. I mean, of course you can, but it doesn't get you anywhere. You just have to keep plodding, and shouldn't underestimate small steps. It was Margaret Mead who said something about a small group of people is the only thing, it's what's going to make a difference. It's the only thing that ever had. One thing after another, one thing after another.
And I do think that's the benefit of being a little older, as you and I are, that, you know,
really?
when because I remember when Catholics and Protestants couldn't marry, you know, and have Christian and Jewish dialogue was cutting edge. And now we see this celebration of faiths and people. And yes, there's anti-Semitism and there's Islamic phobia and all that. That's always been there. But I see the real movement that has been there. And it doesn't go, like you say, up a ladder. It maybe goes in a labyrinth in a different circles, but I feel like it has made an impact. And when you look at the long range, it gives me hope.
I think you're right. And at the same time, it doesn't always work that way. Like, I have to say, honestly, right now, I think anti-Semitism has experienced a resurgence. It has always been there for millennia. And now and again, it rages vehemently, and then it goes underground. And right now, it's above ground again.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you can't give up. You have to, we're in the midst, we're talking right now, in the midst of a holiday called Hanukkah. And each night we light another candle. And it's dark. It's a dark winter and it's a cold winter. And we have to light a candle.
And what do you think is the rise of anti-Semitism? Because clearly there's been many studies and statistics have proven this. So we know this isn't just, you know, you and I having that feeling. There's been clearly showing across our country and probably in the world, there is this rise of anti-Semitism. And what do you think is at the root of that?
Well, it's been there. What can I tell you is the root of it? It's been there for a very long time. Once you say that in order to define who you are, you have to define who you are over and against another people or religion. So, you know, unfortunately, Christianity defined itself over and against Judaism and made a distinction, or some of its proponents tried to distinguish between Judaism as a tradition of law, an eye for an eye, revenge, and Christianity as a tradition of love and compassion and forgiveness. That is simply an incorrect dichotomy. Love, you know, love your neighbor as yourself was actually a Jewish concept or a Christian concept.
That's right.
But you can always find the worst in every tradition and lift it up as the normative of the tradition. But, you know, Jews were said to have killed Jesus. Jews were said to be part of the old covenant, and that there was a new and better and more compassionate and loving covenant. And that caused a hatred of Jews that presented itself in the general public, in literature.
Yes.
And that remains a tradition that I have to say is continually preached. I've seen it because I write for children. I've seen it in children's books. I've seen it in Sunday school class. I see it in the newspaper, taking old diatribes and misunderstandings and dichotomy and resurfacing them. And then when something bad happens, well, you always look for a scapegoat, and Jews are convenient. Right. They're small, and we remember bad stories that people told, and it is really dangerous.
Yeah,
really dangerous.
And you know, that's just one of the things that I have felt so regretful about as a Christian pastor, and I've tried to help erode some of that misunderstanding and ways that really those of us who are Christians need to realize, confess, and claim and say, the Jews didn't kill Jesus, and Jesus was a Jew, and it was a political leaders and maybe a religious leader at that time, individuals who were doing it for a certain time, but to make a blanket statement on any group. And,
well, listen, I mean, you just have to be clear. It was Rome. And the reason that Christianity didn't want to talk about Rome being the perpetrator was because you had the Holy Roman Empire and Rome was adopting church doctrine. So there's a lot of history behind it. And there's a lot of good work being done in Jewish-Christian relations that's trying to overcome this past misunderstanding, which was so dangerous. That needs to be part of interfaith dialogue as well. It's, what happens in interfaith dialogue usually is, well, let's get to know each other, which is wonderful. Let's enjoy each other's holiday traditions. Let's understand where they come from. But we also have to take the harder step is let's understand how we're different.
Right.
And what hurts each of us and what each of us fears. You can't really be a friend of someone unless you know what hurts that person. And that's the next step in dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's very well spoken there. And what do you think, why is there a rise in anti-Semitism now? What's going on? What's causing this to happen, you think?
Well, I think lots of things are happening. Okay. There's an economic downturn. People are struggling financially. People are struggling with healthcare and with jobs. And so whenever there are dark times, and then people usually like to blame someone else. So a minority is usually a safer group to blame than a large group. I think the Middle East conflict has inflamed the concern. And instead of understanding what's happening in the Middle East as a very difficult and complex political conflict, it has then turned, to hatred against Jews everywhere. I mean, people claim that you can be an anti-Zionist without being an anti-Semite. I actually don't believe that. I think they are connected to one another, and that's what's feeding all this.
Yeah. Well, let me move to a little more kind of warmer, positive note, because I love that you've written some children's books. Yes. and they're wonderful, and I talk about a little bit of why you wrote those and what is you're trying to help people understand in these books.
I'd love to. Actually, the picture you have up is a book that's coming out this March 2026. Miriam and her dancing school shoes, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But in general, when I first started writing children's books, I was looking for a book for my own children and the children I taught in Sunday school that would talk about God and faith tradition in a way that I felt was helpful and inspiring. And I have to say, sadly, I couldn't find anything. I found books that just, taught you about holidays. And I also found books that talked about God in ways that I didn't think was helpful. So I said, well, maybe I'll try to write something. I was actually taking a class at Christian Theological Seminary. And I asked the professor, would you mind if I tried to write a book about God? And she was supportive. And that's what became my first book, God's Paintbrush. I believe that children have a deeply spiritual life. It's not like we have to make them spiritual. They are born with that deep spirit. After all, they have this incredible sense of wonder, creativity, and imagination. Actually, it's as they grow older that they tend to lose that. We don't cultivate that. So the question is not that do they have a spiritual life? The question is, yes, they do, but they don't have a language to express it. And we need to give them that language. And my writing for children has been supply the language, that give them an opportunity to talk about God, not to tell them what we think they should believe, but have them tell us what they believe, and opening up their conversation so they can have ideas about God that are not ones they later reject. There's this wonderful story that I always tell about a parochial school. In one end of the cafeteria line at the beginning, there's a big bowl of apples, and the teacher writes a sign over the apples, take only one, God is watching. And then at the end of the cafeteria line, there's a big plate of warm chocolate chip cookies over which a student has written a sign that says, take all you want, God is watching the apples. So when you think about that, we're often telling children things that we don't really believe and then don't make sense to them. Can we open up a conversation about God that helps children see the holy and the sacred in the everyday?
Wow, I think that's so good, not just for children, but for adults, because I think you're right.
My children's book for adults, absolutely.
I think you're right. A lot of, as we get older, we no longer buy into maybe what we were taught in a traditional way about God or about other people. I was taught that people of other faiths were not, faithful people. They were sinners. They were going to go to hell. I never bought it. But then that made me disengage from God altogether, until I found a new way of talking about God that had some credibility and some faith. And I think for a lot of people, they're trying to find words to understand how God is not like a being out there, the traditional way that's judging and going to strike you down. We don't believe in that. But yet, if there is this loving spirit, universal consciousness, this higher power, how do we understand and relate to that? And
so the language, that's the problem, that we often tell kids things we think will make it easy for them to grasp, but the truth is we don't actually believe it. And then when it doesn't work, the children go, well, I'm going to reject that. You tell, children play really hard and grandma will get better, and grandma doesn't get better. And then, did I not pray hard enough? Was she not good enough? You raise these questions. What if instead you created a language that was concrete, it was rich in metaphor, and open to a continuing conversation? That's the kind of religious language we should use. So, what if we named experiences of surprise and beauty and goodness and compassion, courage and justice as sacred? What if we said those were holy moments? I kind of use the image of God like electricity. Electricity runs through the wires in our homes, but the light only goes on when we flip the switch. So, the divine and the sacred run through the world constantly, but we only can see it if we flip the switch. We're the switch. And to empower children to do that is a great thing. And it gives them some sense of agency, and it helps them make the holy in the ordinary.
I love that image. We have to flip the switch, and the sacred is natural. We're kind of coming to the end of this time. It's been such a rich conversation, and I appreciate so much sharing this with me. What would be, though, maybe a closing blessing or a hope for those who are listening, who maybe are dealing with a lot of these things that we've talked about? What would you want them to take away from this?
Well, I'm going to, if I have time, two things. So, and they're both kind of in story form, as you might expect. Please. So, the first one is the story of Cain and Abel, which I'm sure listeners are familiar with. Two brothers. Cain's offering is not accepted by God, and Abel's is, and Cain gets jealous and angry and kills his brother. And then the story is that Cain has to go wandering, and God puts a mark on his forehead. And what is that mark? That's the question. The rabbis in Jewish tradition say, I wonder what that mark might have been. Now, they have, of course, many answers, but the one that strikes me the most is the answer that says the mark on Cain's forehead was a Hebrew letter, Vav, and that means and, A-N-D. What God wanted to say, according to the rabbis, that it's about you and your brother. It's about you and everybody else. How the message that we need is to recognize we have to find connection. We cannot live in the world as isolated entities and individuals. The mark that God wanted to leave for us to see was the word and. Not either or, but both and. And how can we continue to build those connections? And in fact, here's another just beautiful image that, each day each day of the week in Hebrew has a letter. So the sixth day, the letter is the letter Vav, which is and. So human beings are created, according to rabbinic tradition, on the day of the and. We were not meant to be alone. And instead of keep dividing each other, we have to find a way of connecting with each other. So that's the one message I would like to leave. And then here's the other one, which is a story about hope. So Adam and Eve, as we all know, sinned as soon as they're created, or ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And after the first Sabbath, it says that the sun set. So according to the Genesis story, the sun doesn't really set until after the Sabbath, because the Sabbath is supposed to be a day of sun and delight. So when the sun sets, according to rabbinic tradition, it says that Adam and Eve are afraid. And they don't think the sun will rise again. And they think it's the end of the world, because everything will die without the sun. And at that moment, God shows Adam and Eve two stones, the shadow of death and darkness, and teaches them to rub those two stones together to make a spark and create fire. And the fire helps them get through the night until the sun rises again. I found this an incredibly powerful story. Two stones, they aren't two jewels, they're two dark stones. And rub them together and we make a spark, and it helps us get through the night. And in these days, we need that more than ever.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Thank you so much, Rabbi Sasso, for having this conversation. And we will put in the description the link to your website.
Oh, thank you.
I know they can get your children's books on Amazon. And
the book, just sellers, and including bookstores, children's bookstores, or big bookstores around, they're available. Can I just say one word about this new book that's coming out?
Yes, please.
So you showed a picture of Miriam and her dancing shoes. So this is another story about hope. So the people of Israel come to the Sea of Reeds. There is this raging sea in front of them. There are the Egyptians chasing them, and they have to move forward. And so they start going through the sea. And while some people are quite energetic and they're following Moses, other people are left behind, and they don't move as fast, and they're not as agile, and they are ready to give up. Okay, I can't go. I can't even see Moses anymore. I don't know where I'm going. And Miriam says, okay, I'm going to put on my dancing shoes that I took with me on this journey, and you're going to dance with me through the sea. And they lift their feet, and we'll go back to the image again, and they dance. And Miriam plays her tambourine, and they get through the sea, and they begin again. Because what did Miriam do? She made the sound of hope. And that's similar to the story about Adam and Eve's first sunset. But the idea is a little bit of music, a little bit of dance, a little bit of art can get us through the hard times.
Oh, yes. And I think that's so wonderful. And, it makes me want to go dance a little.
Oh,
so
great.
I think later today, when I find my wife, Diane, I'm going to say we have to dance. And I hope you do that with Dennis. So thank you again. And thank you for everybody for watching and listening to this. If you'd like to have further conversations and be a part of our interviews, please subscribe. We also have the guided meditations and reflections, Whispers of the Sacred Rebel, that I bring out weekly. And may you keep your mind and your heart open, Sacred Rebel, and dance a little today.